useless Labour government are doing the impossible. They're actually making things worse. They really are. Look who we've got running the country at the moment. Free Gear Keir. Or Never Hear Keir. We've got Rachel from Accounts. We know her, don't we? Angela Rayner, the no-brainer. You got Mad Miliband, that net zero fanatic. And let's not forget our very own mastermind, David Lammy.
March 2025 saw one of the most intense political battles in recent years unfold in the UK House of Commons. The day seemed like an ordinary day in the political world, with yet another rhetorical battle between opposition and government parties. However, what happened on this day dramatically changed the course of the political conversation and called into question the entire system on which the Labour Party's campaign was built. It all started with a simple but extremely uncomfortable question for Keir Starmer, which was posed to him by Lee Anderson. Lee Anderson, a Conservative MP, has long established himself as a harsh critic of Labour policy. But on this day, he didn't just deliver another criticism. He got Starmer to stand in front of the entire nation and admit that the Labour-led government is not prepared to provide any concrete data that could prove the effectiveness of their climate change policies, particularly their ambitious zero-carbon targets. The question that came out of Anderson's mouth was simple but devastating. If the UK achieved zero carbon tomorrow, how much would it affect the planet's temperature? It wasn't just a technical question. It was a challenge that exposed vulnerabilities in the Labour Party's policies and made anyone who was following the situation wonder what was really behind their glib promises.
He's a proper chopper, isn't he? You know what, here at Reform UK, we've got Nigel Farage, Richard Tice, Rupert Lowe, all successful businessmen and politicians. We've got Zia Youssef and Nick Candy, again, in the back room, all successful businessmen. We've also got now Elon Musk and President... and President Trump as friends of Nigel. But who do Labour have speaking out for them? Carol Vorderman and David Lammy. What a load of rubbish that is.
Starmer, as you would expect from a seasoned politician, tried to respond. But his answer was more akin to political evasion than anything that could be called reasoned. Instead of providing figures and facts that could support Labour's ambitious plans, Starmer went on a rant about opportunities for growth, new jobs and the importance of securing Britain's future. He did not explain how these words related to the real consequences for the planet, nor did he provide evidence that a zero-carbon policy would actually save the world from climate catastrophe. All he offered was a loud but empty political set of words. But what happened next is what made the whole room, and later, the country freeze with bewilderment. Lee Anderson, not satisfied with the inarticulate answer, immediately responded in strong terms, stating that this was not an answer but rather a political withering of the issue. He emphasized that British citizens deserve concrete data, as they will be forced to pay for these ambitious targets. He demanded to understand exactly how much the Earth's temperature would drop by if the UK met its zero-emissions pledge. This question was not just rhetorical, but a genuine attempt to bring the conversation back to the pragmatic. After all, the Labour Party has always talked about its commitment to solving global problems, but has avoided providing concrete evidence that these solutions will actually lead to real improvements in the climate situation. The silence that followed was deafening. It was a silence in which everyone could feel the foundations of trust in a political leader actually floating. Starmer was beginning to get visibly nervous, which was impossible not to notice. He again tried to evade the question by talking about green industries, investment, and the future. But the truth was that his answer was so far removed from the real issue that it was no longer even respectable as a political move. It looked more like a pathetic attempt to avoid inconvenient facts. At this point, it was obvious. Starmer could not or would not answer the key question that faced Britain and its citizens. Why? Because as anyone with a little knowledge of climate issues knew, the UK is just one of many countries, and its contribution to global carbon emissions is less than 1%. Even if the UK achieved zero carbon emissions tomorrow, the change in global temperature would be so small that it could barely be measured in a climate model. Starmer knew this, of course, and that's why he avoided answering, because admitting it would have called into question the Labour Party's entire political programme on climate change. Thus was born the political disaster that soon engulfed the whole country. This moment became not just a question about climate, but a question about the very nature of Starmer's leadership. He demonstrated a complete lack of ability to address the real issues and answer the basic questions that concern not only MEPs but ordinary citizens. Lee Anderson, on the other hand, demonstrated not only political courage, but also the ability to expose his opponent's weaknesses with precise questions, forcing the whole country to reconsider its attitude towards the Labour Party and its leader. After this embarrassing debacle in the House of Commons, when Keir Starmer again dodged a critical question from Lee Anderson, the public began to realise that they were facing not just another political game, but a real disaster for Labour. Anderson, like a true master of political combat, did not limit himself to this single moment in Parliament. He understood that not only the political elite, but the whole country needed to see how the Labour Party leader was evading responsibility and hiding the truth. So after only a few hours, he took the fight to the media space, exposing Starmer not only in Parliament but also on the national stage. Anderson couldn't afford to become complacent about what happened in the House of Commons. He knew that to deal a truly crushing blow to Starmer's credibility and reputation, it would be necessary not just to hit him on the day of the debate, but to keep building up the pressure to create a real political crisis. Realizing this, he quickly headed to the GB News screen, where in his usual incisive style he trashed the Labour leadership, and especially the mediocrity of Starmer's response. It wasn't just a botched attempt at a response, it was a complete shirking of responsibility, he said, frankly expressing his disappointment. There was a sense of political rage in his words, but also a sense of justice, as if he were the voice of the people who had been duped by promises and covert political maneuvering. Anderson went even further. He declared that Starmer's refusal to answer a question that stumped the entire Labour Party was not mere ignorance or incompetence. It was a deliberate evasion of the real numbers and facts that show Labour politicians have a long history of playing with the public's emotions, covering their decisions with political slogans not backed up by real results. It's not just politics, it's manipulation, Anderson said, refusing to accept Starmer's excuses. His arguments instantly resonated with the hearts of millions of viewers who are tired of political promises that have no basis in reality. He outlined how Labour is using zero carbon as a weapon to advance its economic and social interests, but completely ignores how these decisions will affect real people. His every word, his every expose, shook up the UK political field. Anderson was not just a political opponent of Starmer, he became a symbol of truth and justice, making Labour look frankly weak. The words he uttered on air went viral. Social media literally exploded with the anger and frustration of people who had always doubted the real effectiveness of Labour's policies. Comments and discussions online about how such a defeat could be allowed for a policy that was supposed to build the future, but failed to provide even basic data-flooded news feeds. With each passing hour, the number of people supporting Anderson only increased. There was not only praise in his direction, but also thanks from citizens who were tired of political emptiness and promises that didn't produce results. This moment was the catalyst for a much more serious process. With each passing day, the pressure on the Labour Party and its leader Starmer grew stronger. Had the situation been mere political talk, perhaps it would soon have been forgotten. But Anderson did not let it be forgotten. He turned the issue into a national conversation, truly putting Starmer in a corner. The more Starmer tried to avoid answering and deflected direct questions, the stronger the reaction from the public and political commentators became. It wasn't just a continuation of the debate, it became a real public trial, where evidence of the weakness and failure of Labour's policies was laid bare. The funny and tragic thing was that the more Labour tried to ignore the problem became a political crisis that gradually eroded their position. Anderson literally exposed the Labour Party to the light by unravelling their strategy and forcing them to question themselves. Even those who had been close supporters of Labour began to have doubts. Some began to ask questions that Starmer could not answer, and others began to question his leadership skills outright, believing that such a politician could not lead the country to a brighter future if he could not even honestly answer questions about climate policy. Meanwhile, panic set in Labour's cabinets. They couldn't just forget what had happened because the entire UK political landscape was shaken by this moment. Even some in Labour's inner circle began whispering that Starmer must answer for his inability to cope with the pressure. Labour was caught in a trap that had no easy way out. Starmer's answers became increasingly confused and less convincing, and public support plummeted. The image of the Labour Party and its leader was so damaged that it was becoming increasingly impossible to repair. In this context, Anderson was not just Starmer's political opponent. He became a tribunal that called into question not only Starmer's leadership but the very future of the Labour Party. After Lee Anderson descended on Keir Starmer, exposing his failure to answer a simple but fundamental question about the Labour Party's climate policy. The situation began to unfold rapidly. The Labour Party, long confident of its leadership, was now facing a crisis of confidence that was rapidly developing into a veritable political storm. It soon became obvious Starmer was not only unable to answer the critical question, but was not prepared to defend his own policies. The external and internal political environment began to change rapidly, and the pressure on Starmer seemed to grow daily. Members of the Labour Party, despite their initial loyalty, began to get nervous. Political observers and analysts seemed to argue unequivocally that the loss of control over an important policy issue that hit the foundations of all the party's stated positions was a major blow to his reputation. But even that was not the major blow to Starmer. The worst for him began when the scandal in which he was embroiled broke. Shortly after the clash, shocking leaks began to emerge in Parliament that cast doubt on Labour's entire strategy. Documents that soon found their way into the hands of journalists revealed that several high-profile Labour consultants had long warned Starmer about the financial and economic implications of a zero-carbon policy. As it turned out, Labour's zero-emissions plans were unlikely to have any real climate effect, but they were not prepared to admit this publicly. What's more, the documentation revealed that the party had been hiding this data from voters, fearing a political backlash in the run-up to the election. This revelation was a real political explosion. It was at this point that the active defense phase began. Internal disputes within the Labour Party were growing. One by one, political observers and some party members began to raise doubts about Starmer's leadership qualities. Some of his closest supporters argued strongly that if Starmer could not defend his policies, his position in the party would be severely weakened. The party's policy course of addressing climate change through ambitious zero-carbon targets was now being harshly criticized not only by the opposition, but also within the Labour Party itself. Even those who had once supported Starmer were speaking out about it. Questions began to be asked already within the cabinet, when the consequences of these policy decisions for the country's economy became apparent. But was it even possible to achieve the goals without significant sacrifices? And most importantly, if these measures were to have such consequences, would it not be worth reconsidering course? And many felt that the party should have been prepared to explain itself publicly rather than hide the truth. Meanwhile, Lee Anderson did not relent. He was convinced that responsibility for the situation must lie not only with Starmer, but with the entire Labour Party, which had recklessly pursued policies unsupported by concrete and transparent data. In response to these internal problems, he continued to rain down blows on the party, actively taking to the airwaves and once again questioning Starmer's actions. He did this not only for the sake of political infighting, but also to create public pressure that could lead to change in the Labour Party. He became an active player in the media space. His speeches continued to gain popularity, and his words were increasingly quoted. Social media was flooded with comments, memes and discussions in which citizens expressed their doubts about Labour's policies. With each passing day, popular opinion against Labour only grew stronger. They could no longer continue to claim that their policies were the wise and forward-looking solution for the country. It was becoming clear Labour's zero-carbon policy, while attractive on paper, was nothing more than a political manipulation used to strengthen their position for the future. And all this falsehood was now becoming obvious to a wider audience. Against the backdrop of this crisis, as the Labour Party tried to rebuild its reputation, new challenges began to appear on the horizon. The level of popular discontent continued to rise, and now it was no longer just the right wing, but also the centrist and left-wing media that began to challenge Starmer's policies. Were questions about whether their ambitions were effective and realistic led many to question the future of the Labour Party and its ability to win future elections. It was a moment of truth for the party elite. The divisions within Labour were becoming increasingly clear. Party circles began to discuss the possibility of a change of leader, and opinions on this issue were divided. Some believed that the party should urgently change Starmer to avoid defeat in the elections, while others feared that such a move would cause a complete split. When Lee Anderson came out forcefully to demand a parliamentary debate on zero-emissions policy, his statement, which at first appeared to be just another attack, was a turning point. Anderson, who had initially appeared as a loner, suddenly found himself riding a wave of popular support, and his ideas began to be heard louder and more confidently. He demanded that Labour provide concrete answers, not prevarication. In response, Labour was only strengthened in its desire to ignore the request, realizing that it could not justify its actions to the public if it answered honestly. But this moment was in fact not only the end of Starmer's career, but also the beginning of a new phase for British politics, where simply avoiding questions could no longer be a strategy.